As the sun set on his long, weary life, Elias Ward, a widowed historian with a heart burdened by regrets, ventured into the infamous Black Forest. His final wish, to uncover a relic whispered in forgotten tomes, the sacred mirror of prophecy. Legends claimed it revealed truths of past, present, and future, but at a steep price. Shrouded in mist and ancient whispers, Elias tread into the labyrinth of shadows, unaware that his quest would unravel secrets older than time itself and awaken forces beyond comprehension. Elias Ward stood in the quiet solitude of his study, surrounded by dusty shelves of forgotten histories. He had spent years unearthing the secrets of the past, but the greatest mystery of his life remained unsolved: the disappearance of his wife and daughter over 3 decades ago. They had vanished on a trip to Europe near the borders of Germany, where the Black Forest loomed like a forbidden shadow. Authorities called it an accident, but Elias never believed it. There were whispers, legends, but no answers. The letter had arrived 2 weeks ago, unsigned and with no return address. The parchment smelled faintly of moss and soil, as though it had traveled through time itself. Inside was a map, hand-drawn and detailed, marking a path through the Black Forest. Accompanying it were words that haunted him. "The truth you seek lies within the mirror of prophecy, but be warned, all truths demand a price." Elias hesitated. He was old, his body failing him, but the hunger for answers gnawed at his soul. For years he had pored over documents about the forest, its myths, its cursed reputation. Some spoke of an ancient artifact hidden deep within, capable of revealing the past, present, and future. Others warned that those who sought it were never seen again. And yet, he could not resist. Perhaps it was foolish, but Elias had nothing left to lose. Packing only essentials, a flashlight, a notebook, a flask of water, and his late wife's compass, he set off for Germany. The flight was uneventful, but as he approached the Black Forest, the weight of his decision grew heavier. Locals at the nearest village refused to speak to him when he asked for directions. They looked away, muttering under their breath. Only one man, an old innkeeper, dared to speak. "If you value your life, sir," he whispered, "stay away. The forest is alive and it does not forgive." Undeterred, Elias entered the forest at dawn. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy above, casting long shadows that danced with the morning breeze. The forest felt ancient, alive in a way that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The map led him deeper, past twisted roots and moss-covered stones. It was not long before he noticed the unnatural stillness. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Hours passed, and Elias began to feel the strain of his journey. The terrain grew more treacherous, the air colder. As he rested by a stream, he heard it for the first time. A whisper, faint and indistinct, carried by the wind. He froze, straining to listen. "Turn back," the voice seemed to say. His heart pounded, but he pressed on. Fear would not stop him, not after all he had endured. The first sign of something truly unnatural came at dusk. Elias stumbled upon a circle of stones, each one etched with runes he could not decipher. The air within the circle felt different, heavier. As he stepped closer, a chill ran down his spine. The runes began to glow faintly and the whispering returned, louder this time. "Why have you come?" it demanded. Elias clenched his fists, forcing himself to speak. "I seek the truth," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. The glow faded, and the forest grew silent once more. Night fell quickly in the Black Forest, enveloping Elias in darkness. His flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. He followed the map closely, aware that any misstep could leave him hopelessly lost. The whispers continued, now joined by rustling noises that seemed to come from nowhere. He tried to dismiss them as tricks of the mind, but doubt gnawed at him. Just as exhaustion threatened to overtake him, Elias reached a clearing. In its center stood a monolithic structure, an ancient archway made of black stone, covered in the same runes as the stones he had seen earlier. It pulsed faintly, as though alive. The map ended here, but there was no sign of the mirror. As he approached, the ground beneath him trembled. A voice, deep and resonant, filled the clearing. "You have been watched, Elias Ward. The mirror awaits, but the path is fraught with peril. Will you take the risk?" Elias's hands shook, but his resolve remained. "I will," he said firmly. The archway began to shimmer, and the space within it twisted, revealing a pathway of light. Summoning every ounce of courage, Elias stepped through, leaving behind the familiar world and entering the unknown. As the light enveloped him, Elias felt a strange sensation, as though time and space were folding around him. Memories surfaced, his wife's laughter, his daughter's small hand in his, only to be replaced by darker images, their cries as they vanished into the void. His chest tightened, but he pressed on. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it. He had to. The pathway of light delivered Elias into a world that defied logic. The air shimmered faintly, as if infused with trapped starlight, and the trees stretched impossibly high, their bark twisted into grotesque patterns. The forest felt alive, its silence heavy, as though the very ground pulsed with an ancient heartbeat. Every step Elias took seemed to awaken the shadows around him, yet no clear threat emerged. As the glowing archway behind him disappeared, Elias realized the map had served its purpose. Now, he was left to navigate by instinct alone. The path forward was narrow and serpentine, and the deeper he went, the thicker the air became, as if resisting his every move. Then came the whispers, faint and scattered, weaving an unsettling melody that gnawed at his resolve. He walked for hours, his muscles aching and his mind clouded by doubt. Suddenly, a sharp voice, neither a whisper nor an echo, broke the silence. "You shouldn't have come." Elias turned sharply, his flashlight jerking upward. A figure stepped from the shadows, tall and lean, his movements fluid as if the darkness itself guided him. His piercing green eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and his dark cloak swayed as though alive. "Who are you?" Elias demanded, his voice uneven. The figure regarded him coolly. "Kale," he said, his tone clipped, "and you are trespassing." "I'm here for the Mirror of Prophecy," Elias said, summoning what courage he had. "I received a letter." Kale's gaze sharpened. "A letter? From whom?" His tone betrayed suspicion, as though Elias's words disrupted a delicate balance. Elias took a step forward, holding his ground. It said, "The truth I seek lies within the mirror." Kyle studied him for a long moment, his expression inscrutable. "If you're serious, you'll need a guide," he said finally. "But heed this, those who seek the mirror seldom return whole." Despite Kale's warnings, Elias followed him deeper into the forest. The path seemed to shift under their feet, and at times, the way ahead disappeared entirely until Kale pointed the way forward. The silence grew oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic hum that seemed to resonate from the forest itself. Kyle occasionally spoke, offering cryptic pieces of the forest's history. "This isn't just a forest," Kale said as they crossed a bridge of ancient stone. "It's a boundary, a place meant to contain something far older than you can imagine. The mirror is the key, but it's also the lock." Elias frowned but kept his questions to himself. The few times he pressed for details, Kale's responses were evasive, and his tone suggested that some truths were best left undiscovered. The sun, or whatever light illuminated this realm, began to fade, and the forest grew colder. They stopped to rest in a small clearing, where Kale built a fire with practiced ease. The flames cast long, flickering shadows, and the warmth was a welcome reprieve from the forest's chill. "Why are you helping me?" Elias asked after a long silence. "Why not turn me away?" Kyle stared into the fire. "Because the forest has its own way of dealing with intruders. If I hadn't found you, it would have claimed you by now. At least with me, you have a chance." Before Elias could respond, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. The fire flickered, its flames dimming as the air grew heavy with tension. Cale rose to his feet, his expression grim. "They've found us," he said. "We need to move." "Who?" Elias asked, panic rising in his chest. Kyle didn't answer. He extinguished the fire with a sweep of his hand and grabbed Elias's arm. "Run," he commanded. Together, they plunged into the forest, the shadows around them writhing as though alive. The chase was a blur. The whispers morphed into guttural voices, their words incomprehensible but filled with malice. Shapes moved in the periphery, dark and shifting, their forms refusing to solidify. The trees themselves seemed to twist and bend, their roots reaching for Elias's feet. His heart thundered, and every breath felt like fire in his lungs, but Cale never slowed. Finally, they burst into a clearing unlike any Elias had seen before. The air here was still, almost sacred, and the ground was covered in strange, glowing moss. At its center stood a massive stone pillar etched with runes that pulsed faintly, casting the area in an eerie light. Cale stopped, releasing Elias's arm. "This is as far as I go," he said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "Beyond this point, the trials begin." "What trials?" Elias asked, trying to steady his breathing. Kyle gestured to the pillar. "The forest will test you. If you survive, the path to the mirror will reveal itself. If not—" He let the words hang in the air. Elias hesitated, but the determination that had driven him this far refused to waver. He stepped forward, approaching the pillar. The runes glowed brighter as he neared, their light pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. Kyle watched him silently, his expression a mix of hope and resignation. As Elias reached out to touch the pillar, the whispers fell silent, and the air grew heavy. The moment his fingers brushed the stone, the world around him dissolved into blinding light. And then there was nothing. Elias awoke in darkness, the faint glow of the runes still lingering in his vision. The air was thick and suffocating, like a weight pressing down on his chest. He reached out blindly, his fingers brushing against cool stone. As his senses returned, he realized he was in an enclosed space, a cavern carved by something ancient, its walls smooth but unnatural. A faint light flickered ahead, beckoning him forward. Elias hesitated, but there was no turning back now. He staggered to his feet, his body sore and trembling, and began walking toward the light. As he moved, the air seemed to hum around him, a low, resonant sound that matched the beat of his own heart. The whispers returned, soft and insidious, their words elusive but filled with intent. The cavern opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow. At the center stood 3 massive doors, each adorned with intricate carvings. They depicted scenes of triumph and tragedy, of heroes and villains, their faces twisted in anguish or ecstasy. Above the doors, an inscription glowed faintly. "To know truth, one must endure. Choose your trial." Elias felt a chill run down his spine. The doors seemed to pulse with energy, as though alive. He approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the carvings for clues. Each door told a story, and each story seemed to mirror a part of his own life. The first depicted a man standing before a roaring fire, his hands outstretched as if to embrace it. The second showed a figure standing on the edge of a cliff, the stormy sea below reflecting their anguished face. The third door displayed a man surrounded by shadows, their shapes closing in on him. Elias hesitated, his breath catching in his throat. The choice felt monumental, as though his very soul hung in the balance. He closed his eyes, the words of the inscription echoing in his mind. To know truth, one must endure. Finally, he stepped toward the third door. The shadows on its surface seemed to writhe in anticipation as his hand touched the cold stone. The moment he pushed it open, the chamber dissolved, and Elias found himself standing in a forest clearing, eerily similar to the one he had left behind. But this forest was different, darker, heavier, and charged with an unnatural energy. The whispers grew louder, taking on voices now, their words distinct and accusatory. "You abandoned them," they hissed. "You let them disappear." Elias spun around, his chest tightening. "No," he shouted. "I didn't abandon them. I tried everything to find them." The voices ignored his protests, growing louder and more relentless. Shapes emerged from the shadows, humanoid but distorted, their features blurred as though they were only half-formed. They circled him, their movements deliberate and menacing. Elias backed away, his heart pounding. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "To face the truth," the shadows replied in unison. Their voices were cold, devoid of emotion. "Face it, or be consumed." The clearing began to shift, the ground beneath Elias's feet rippling like water. He stumbled, falling to his knees as the shadows closed in. They towered over him, their forms stretching and twisting until they became a wall of darkness. From within the darkness, a scene began to take shape, a memory Elias had buried deep within himself. It was the day of the disappearance. He saw himself standing on the platform of a small train station, his wife and daughter boarding the train ahead of him. He had been preoccupied, distracted by a work call. His wife had waved, her smile tinged with frustration as the train doors closed. He had promised to catch the next train, to meet them at their destination. But he never arrived. The memory shifted, showing the aftermath. The empty train, the panicked search, the unanswered questions. Elias felt tears stream down his face as the shadows whispered, "You let them go. You weren't there." "I didn't know," Elias cried. "I didn't know it would happen." The shadows paused, their movements slowing. One stepped forward, its form solidifying into that of a young girl, a reflection of his daughter. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. "You could have stopped it," she said, her voice soft but filled with sorrow. "But you didn't." Elias reached out, his hand trembling. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." The girl's form flickered, and the shadows began to recede. The clearing returned to its original state, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. The voices softened, fading into the background. A new path appeared before Elias, lined with glowing stones that pulsed gently, guiding the way forward. He stood on shaky legs, his mind reeling from what he had just experienced. The forest had forced him to confront his greatest regret, and though he felt raw and exposed, there was also a strange sense of clarity. He had faced the truth, and he had endured. As he walked down the path, the whispers returned, but this time they were softer, almost encouraging. The trial was far from over, but Elias knew he had taken the first step toward the mirror, and toward the answers he sought. Elias continued along the glowing path, his steps slow but steady. The air around him began to shift, growing warmer and lighter, though the oppressive presence of the forest never completely faded. The whispers had softened, but the hum remained, resonating deep in his chest like a persistent reminder of the trials he had yet to face. As he walked, the path widened, revealing a new sight that made him stop in his tracks. In the distance stood an enormous tree, its trunk so wide it could have housed a village. Its bark shimmered faintly, and its branches stretched impossibly high, disappearing into the canopy above. At its base stood a pedestal, and on it rested an object that seemed to defy logic. The sacred mirror. Elias approached cautiously, his heart pounding. The mirror was unlike anything he had imagined. Its frame was carved from a silver metal that pulsed faintly, as though alive, and its surface wasn't glass but a liquid-like substance that rippled gently, reflecting light in ways that made it seem otherworldly. Standing before it, Elias felt as though he was being watched, not by the mirror, but by the forest itself. He hesitated, Kale's warnings echoing in his mind. The mirror is not what you think it is. Its power comes at a cost. But Elias couldn't turn back now. He had come too far, endured too much. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and touched the surface. The world around him dissolved. Elias found himself standing in a void, an endless expanse of light and shadow. The mirror was gone, replaced by a swirling vortex that pulsed with a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. Slowly, images began to form within the vortex, flickering like scenes from a film. They showed fragments of his life, his happiest moments, his greatest failures, and, most prominently, the day his wife and daughter disappeared. The vortex spoke, its voice deep and resonant, reverberating in Elias's chest. You seek the truth. Are you prepared to face it? Elias swallowed hard, his throat dry. Yes, he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his insides. The images shifted, focusing on the day of the disappearance. Elias saw himself again at the train station, but this time the perspective changed. He saw the train moving, saw his wife and daughter seated inside, and then he saw what came next. The train entered a tunnel, but it didn't emerge on the other side. Instead, it vanished, leaving behind only faint, shimmering traces of light. What happened? Elias demanded. Where did they go? The vortex pulsed, and the voice replied, They were taken, Elias Ward, taken by forces beyond your understanding. The images shifted again, showing a figure cloaked in shadow, standing on the platform where Elias had been moments before the train departed. The figure raised a hand, and the train seemed to distort, its edges blurring before it vanished entirely. Elias stared in horror. "Who is that?" he asked. The vortex did not answer immediately. Instead, it showed more images, scenes of the Black Forest, of people entering and never returning, and of the sacred mirror. The shadowy figure appeared in each scene, always watching, always present. Finally, the voice spoke, "The one you see is a guardian, but also a taker. The forest is both a sanctuary and a trap, a place where truths are hidden and revealed." Elias's mind raced. Why? Why my family? The vortex pulsed again, and the images shifted to show Elias himself. "Because you were chosen," the voice said. "Your actions set the path. Your absence created the void that allowed them to be taken." The weight of the revelation hit Elias like a physical blow. He stumbled, his knees buckling beneath him. "No," he whispered. "It wasn't my fault. I didn't know." The vortex's light dimmed, its tone softening. "The truth is not about blame, Elias. It is about understanding. And now you must decide." "Decide what?" Elias asked, his voice trembling. The vortex shifted, and the sacred mirror reappeared before him. This time its surface showed not reflections but possibilities, scenes of what could be, of futures shaped by the choices Elias might make. He saw himself destroying the mirror, freeing the forest from its curse but losing his chance to save his family. He saw himself using the mirror's power, altering time and space but unleashing consequences he couldn't foresee. The possibilities expanded, showing alternate versions of events. In one, he reunited with his family but found the forest in ruins, its balance forever disrupted. In another, he became a part of the forest, bound to guard its secrets for eternity. Each choice seemed both a gift and a punishment, a blessing and a curse. The voice spoke again, finality in its tone. "The mirror reveals. The choice is yours." Elias stood frozen, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He had come seeking answers, but now he faced something far greater. A decision that would shape not just his life, but the lives of others, and perhaps the forest itself. He reached out toward the mirror, his fingers brushing its surface once more, and then the world shattered into light. Elias blinked against the blinding light, his vision adjusting as the world around him reformed. The sacred mirror was gone, and he now stood in a grand hall that seemed carved from the heart of the forest itself. The walls were lined with ancient trees, their bark glowing faintly, and the ceiling above shimmered with a light that seemed to mimic the stars. At the center of the hall stood Kale. Kale's expression was unreadable, his green eyes glowing faintly as they fixed on Elias. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. Elias nodded, his heart still racing from the visions the mirror had shown him. "I've seen enough," he said, "but I don't understand it all. Why me? Why my family? And why were you watching all along?" Kale's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. "The mirror doesn't choose lightly," he said. "It seeks those whose choices have the power to shape the balance of this place, of this forest, and perhaps beyond. But you're asking the wrong question, Elias." "Then what's the right question?" Elias demanded, his frustration boiling over. Kyle stepped closer, his movements deliberate and slow, as if testing Elias's reaction. "The right question," he said, "is what are you willing to sacrifice for the truth?" Elias hesitated, the weight of Kale's words sinking in. "I've already sacrificed everything," he said. "My family, my peace, my life. What else is there to lose?" Kyle's gaze hardened. "The mirror showed you possibilities, but it didn't show you the cost of those possibilities. To save what you love, Elias, you must destroy something else. That's the way of this place. The forest takes as much as it gives." The tension in the air grew thick, and Elias felt his pulse quicken. "You knew this all along," he said, his voice trembling with both anger and fear. "You brought me here, knowing what the mirror would demand." Kyle didn't deny it. "Yes," he said simply. "I brought you here because I need you to make a choice. The mirror is a power too great to be left unchecked. If it falls into the wrong hands, or worse, if it continues to be the forest's plaything, it could destroy everything. But only someone like you can unlock its true potential." Elias stared at Kale, his mind racing. "And what happens to you if I make this choice?" he asked. "Why are you so invested in what I do?" Kyle's expression darkened, and for the first time, Elias saw something close to vulnerability in his eyes. "Because I'm bound to this forest," Kyle said quietly. "I've been its guardian for longer than you can imagine. I was once like you, a man seeking answers. But the forest claimed me, and now I'm part of it. I can't leave, Elias." "But you can." The revelation hit Elias like a blow. "So this was never about helping me," he said bitterly. "It was about freeing yourself." Kale's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. "Call it selfish if you want," he said, "but it doesn't change what you have to do. The mirror has given you the power to choose. Destroy it, and the forest will lose its hold on me. But you'll lose any chance of saving your family. Use it, and you might save them, but you'll unleash consequences you can't even begin to understand." Elias's hands balled into fists. "There has to be another way," he said. "There has to be." Kyle shook his head. "There isn't. The forest doesn't bargain, Elias. It demands payment." The room seemed to darken, the glowing walls pulsing with an ominous rhythm. The air grew colder, and Elias felt the weight of the forest pressing down on him, as if it were aware of the choice he was about to make. Elias turned away from Kale, his thoughts a whirlwind. He saw his wife's smile, his daughter's laughter, the life they could have had if only he had been there for them. But he also saw the visions the mirror had shown him, the destruction, the chaos, the cost of tampering with forces beyond his control. "I can't do this," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible. "You can," Kyle said, stepping closer. You must." Elias looked at Kyle, his anger giving way to despair. "Why me?" he asked again, his voice breaking. "Why did it have to be me?" Kyle's expression softened, and for the first time, his voice carried a hint of compassion. "Because you have the strength to endure what others cannot," he said. "You've already faced your greatest fears. This is just one more step." Elias closed his eyes, the weight of the decision threatening to crush him. He thought of his family, of the life they had lost, and of the life he might still save. But he also thought of Kale, bound to the forest for eternity, and of the countless others who might suffer if he chose wrongly. Finally, Elias opened his eyes, his gaze steady. "I've made my choice," he said. Kyle nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then, do what you must." Elias stepped toward the center of the hall, where the sacred mirror had reappeared, its surface rippling like liquid starlight. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched it one last time. The world erupted in light. The light faded, and Elias found himself in the heart of the Black Forest once more, but the world around him felt different, quieter, heavier, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The sacred mirror was gone, and in its place lay a single shard of its liquid-like surface, glowing faintly at his feet. Its pulsating light dimmed with each passing moment, as though the mirror's energy was draining away forever. Kale stood nearby, his face pale and his form flickering like a shadow on the brink of disappearing. "It's done," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "The choice has been made." Elias knelt and picked up the shard. As his fingers brushed its smooth, cool surface, images flickered across it, fragments of the future he had chosen. He saw his wife and daughter, their faces lit with joy, and his heart clenched with longing. But the shard also revealed the cost of his decision. The forest, once teeming with vibrant magic, had begun to fade. The glowing trees were dimming, their ancient energy dissipating. The whispers that had guided and tormented him were now silent. "What happens now?" Elias asked, his voice trembling as he turned to Kyle. Kyle took a step forward, his movements slower than before. "You've freed the forest from its curse," he said, "but in doing so, you've taken its power. Without the mirror, the forest can no longer sustain itself. Its magic will fade, and with it, its hold on this world." "And my family?" Elias pressed, his voice rising. "Will they return?" Kyle hesitated, his green eyes meeting Elias's with an expression that was equal parts pity and relief. "The choice you made has set the path," he said, "but the mirror's power is not immediate. Its effects ripple through time, touching every corner of existence. You may find them waiting for you, or you may find only echoes of what once was." The weight of Kale's words settled heavily on Elias's shoulders. He had come to the forest seeking answers, but the truth he had uncovered was more complex than he could have imagined. His choices had consequences that extended far beyond him, beyond his family, even beyond the forest. He had altered the balance of an ancient power, and the cost of that choice was yet to fully reveal itself. Kale's form began to waver, his edges blurring as though he were becoming one with the air around him. He looked at Elias one last time, his expression softening. "I'm free," he said, his voice filled with quiet wonder. "For the first time in centuries, I'm free." Before Elias could respond, Kale dissolved into a shimmer of light that rose toward the sky and vanished. The forest around him grew still, its vibrant life dimming further as the last remnants of its magic ebbed away. For the first time since entering the Black Forest, Elias felt truly, utterly alone. He turned and began the long walk back, the shard of the mirror clutched tightly in his hand. The path that had once been treacherous now seemed eerily clear, the trees parting before him as though guiding him out. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of his own footsteps on the soft earth. When Elias finally emerged from the forest, he was greeted by the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. The village he had passed through days ago lay in the distance, its rooftops glowing faintly in the morning light. Yet it was not the same village he had left. The air felt different, lighter, freer, as though the forest's grip on the land had lifted. Elias made his way to the inn, his steps slow and deliberate. The old innkeeper who had warned him before was gone, replaced by a younger man who greeted Elias with a warm smile. "Good morning, traveler," the man said cheerfully. "You look like you've been on quite the journey." Elias nodded, but said nothing, his thoughts too heavy to share. He rented a room and collapsed onto the bed, the shard of the mirror resting on the nightstand beside him. As he drifted into an uneasy sleep, the shard pulsed faintly, its light casting shifting shadows across the walls. When he awoke, the shard was gone. Panic surged through him, but as he searched the room, he found a single note resting where the shard had been. The words were written in a hand he didn't recognize, but their meaning was unmistakable. "The forest remembers. The truth is never lost." Elias stared at the note, his mind racing. The journey he had undertaken had ended, but its effects were only beginning. He had changed the forest, and in doing so, he had changed himself. The choices he had made would ripple through time, shaping not only his future but the futures of those who would come after him. As he left the inn and began the long journey home, Elias felt a strange sense of peace. The answers he had sought had come at a price, but they had also given him something he thought lost forever: hope. Whatever awaited him in the days to come, he would face it with the strength he had gained in the heart of the Black Forest. The forest's legacy was now his own, and though its whispers had fallen silent, they would echo within him for as long as he lived.